I got a crazy teacher who wears dark glasses. Things are going great, and they're only getting better.
Welcome to Module 2 of COMM 660. During this instructional week, we are going to start filling a toolbox with some of the basic elements of both the nature of organizations and the nature of communication. Let's start with establishing a common definition of the word organization. The one we're going to use for this course is a group of people working together to achieve common goals. This can be an organized collection of individuals that can be business, social, volunteer, or maybe have other purposes. This does not include a one-time gathering of people, though. We're talking about ongoing interaction, and their work has to be interdependent, where one person's work affects other work so that they're all working together for a common good or a common goal. Generally, the group has to work with a relatively structured, organized, and open system. That's what we're talking about there, and we're going to define that more in a bit. And individuals must be working toward a common goal as well as their own individual goals. So that's the definition we're talking about here. Let's talk about the types of organizations. There are three types of organizations. The first one is a for-profit organization, and this includes most businesses where the goal is to make more money than they spend. Their whole focus is to make money. The other two types of organizations have a lot of overlap. They are called nonprofit and not-for-profit. They really have a lot of similarities, and their primary differences have to do with taxes and how money is handled. These organizations have to further religious, scientific, charitable, educational, literary, safety causes or purposes. They must have some kind of public good as their primary goal. And they make a profit from time to time, and sometimes they make a profit regularly depending on the nonprofit or not-for-profit organization. However, unlike for-profit businesses, any profit that they generate must be poured back into the organization or donated to their target populations, depending on whether they're not-for-profit or nonprofit. As I said, their primary differences have to do with what they do with their money. Generally speaking, a not-for-profit is thought of as focused on an activity. So the easiest example I could find to understand that better is thinking about a sewing club. And maybe this sewing club makes clothing for a population that needs it. Their focus would be on the activity versus a Red Cross, where the focus is on the service, and they may even give donations to help other things. Okay, that's enough about the nature of organizations with regard to the definition. Let's take a look at some characteristics that are common to all organizations. The first organizational characteristic that is common across all organizations is systems. And systems are interrelated and interdependent by nature. When one element fails, the rest of the system is affected. Even if one element changes, the rest of them are affected. My favorite example of a system is the human body. Just think about how every one part needs the other parts to function well. An example is if you get a fever, what happens to the rest of your systems? They all scramble trying to get your body temperature back down to where it's supposed to be so everything is in equilibrium. So the first characteristic is a system. Organizations are systems. The second characteristic is rules. Rules are formal and informal guidelines for behavior. They vary from organization to organization, and formal rules are often written. You can sometimes find them even in the handbook. They are designed with the intent of making the organization work better, and everyone in the organization is expected to follow rules. So they're pretty formal. It's how we're going to operate. Another characteristic is roles. Everyone in an organization has at least one role to fulfill, or they would not likely be a part of the organization. Roles are assigned responsibilities, but they're not always on the organizational chart. When roles are not performed up to standards, the system gets thrown out of whack and the product or service quality suffers. Roles are what's reviewed when people look at job descriptions, but also when they look at organizational hierarchy. Another characteristic that organizations have in common is structure. Organizations are actually structured to varying degrees. Some have a chain of command that's relatively tall, while others are flatter and function more like a matrix, where they have cross-function responsibilities, or you often hear it called cross-functional teams. Organizations will describe their chain of command on an organizational chart. Sometimes even if there is an org chart, it's actually much more disorganized than you might expect. They might label one person in charge and then it's chaos underneath with just not even a structure well enough, together enough to be drawn. All right, so another organizational characteristic that all organizations have is norms. And norms are established patterns of standards that have become accepted by members. Norms are what people do and what they believe is right sometimes. More often than not, norms are not written into policy, although sometimes they are in existence for so long they eventually get recorded somewhere. The photo on this page represents the norm of following WVU sporting events where spectators and players and pretty much everyone still sticking around at the very end, they join together and sing Country Roads, the song that is so special to West Virginia, originally done by John Denver. Something else that organizations have in common is a certain degree of similarity among their members in order to get their work done. Now, if you're blanching at this idea because of the increased focus on diversity in the last few decades, please just pause a moment, hear me out. We know that some degree of similarity is required for healthy working relationships and improved communication quality. This kind of similarity actually already makes sense to you, I bet. In fact, wherever you work, you probably have some similarities about what's important to you, what you believe, what you value, what your attitude is with some of the people there, hopefully many of them, or else you wouldn't all be working for the same organization. Organizations need members to agree to some degree on several levels because the principle of similarity states that the more two people are similar, the more they are likely to interact and the more successful or meaningful that interaction is likely to be. And then I don't know that the research says this, but I think you could agree that generally that means the product is likely to be better too. We all know that a service or product doesn't usually come out quite as well if there's been poor communication getting there. Status is another organizational characteristic, and I want you to just take a look at these different offices because what we're talking about here is non-formal or informal status. Formal status occurs as a result of the structure of the organization. That's the org chart, right? Informal status also exists in organizations though. Let's say 5 people have the same rank on an org chart, but you and I know, especially if this is your organization, that one of those people has higher status than the other 4. Sometimes this comes with tenure in the organization, but it can also be about visibility. It can be about offices, as you see here. This is a pretty formal one. Here's the standard bullpen, right? Type of responsibility changes with status. Certain people are the only ones allowed to do certain things. Relationships to higher status people, flexibility. And it's interesting how this informal status and what symbolizes it changes over time in organizations. I mean, there was a time, for example, when offices that were luxurious and where they were was the creme de la creme of symbol about informal status, organizational status. But take a look at this picture. Elon Musk doesn't have a desk at the office and has slept on the floor of his factories. Now, he claims that he does this so that he can be in the middle of what's going on and be wherever his organization needs him, or his organizations need him. But really, isn't that the ultimate symbol of informal and formal status? Because it's the ultimate freedom. He can go where he wants, stay where he wants, work where he wants. So that's informal status, even though we've used Elon Musk as an example of that, and he definitely has some formal status in his organizations. Hopefully, you can get the picture. Something else that organizations have in common are their networks. Organizations don't have the same network, but they all have networks, both formal and informal. And the formal networks are pretty easy to delineate because they follow the org chart. They follow the process of service or the process of producing the outcome. But the informal networks are the ones that can make or break your ease and efficiency in a job. Informal networks are about who knows whom. The connections can be a result of friendships from outside of work, children of employees who happen to be on the same sports team or take the same dance classes. It can even be family relationships. Of course, they can also be a result of being around long enough to get to know many organizational members. In any case, spending energy on this, especially when you are new to your organization, can be the key to survival. It's a really crucial piece of getting integrated into an organization. And we'll talk about that later in the semester when we talk about onboarding and organizational socialization. All right, you'll be happy to know this is the last characteristic that's common to all organizations, and it's culture. This is the way a group thinks and behaves. That's their culture. It's represented in a group's shared beliefs, their values, their attitudes. You can see it in language that's unique and that develops over time within that culture. Symbols and shared experiences are also ways you can learn about the organization's culture or determine, what it's like. In a very broad sense, the culture of an organization is essentially the context of the communication that occurs. If you go back to our model, it's that context of our of our communication model. The strength of each organization's culture varies. In this program, this MA program that you're doing, there is an entire semester devoted to learning about organizational culture. That's what a big deal it is. Ideally, you learn as much as possible about a culture before you join a company so that you can help ensure you're in a company that's a good fit for you. And then, of course, continue learning more about it once you get there. All right, let's look at the nature of organizations from another perspective. Have you ever heard of peons? Generally, these are people who are at the bottom of the food chain and require minimal skills to complete their jobs. Since we're focusing on what is required to survive in an organization while we're building these fundamentals this semester, especially how new employees can survive, your authors have a list of principles for survival that generally serve peons quite well, although, quite frankly, many of them apply for our entire careers. So I'm going to go through these 6 principles for peons fairly quickly and just give you highlights of them. The first principle is CYA, which is cover your backside. When making decisions or choices, always be sure that you can justify what you are doing and give yourself an out if you are challenged. So make sure you have all your evidence for the claim that you're making or the challenge that you are putting to someone. Have all that evidence ready to go. Also, if you're a peon, avoid taking extremely risky positions very early in your tenure at an organization because you just probably don't have quite enough credibility to swing it. Or if you do, it's just a really big risk. So make sure you do your courage calculation to help ensure that you've got what you need there. The principle of power is the second principle for peons. To become a supervisor, you must prove to be a good subordinate of some kind. If you don't show that you can do it or do it their way, they can show us the highway, right? So even if it seems unfair, it's not until we demonstrate that we can do it the way the organization wants us to, before anybody much cares about what ideas we have for making things better. So the principle of power is essentially that they have the power, the organization has the power, until we have demonstrated we can do it their way. The first principle of tenure is the third principle for peons. People who have been around for a while and paid their dues have more informal power. It's kind of like the informal status that we talked about. We used to call this flat out the old boys network. Sometimes there is an old girls network element now too, but either way, it's about the people who have the most tenure. And sometimes that network can even have more power than our supervisor. So that's, again, that informal status thing where just because you're highest on the org chart doesn't mean you have the most power. Generally speaking, with the principle of tenure, think of it this way. You don't want to fight with an 800-pound gorilla. It's even recommended to learn who these people are early in the time that we're at an organization. That's what we call survival of the fittest, right? The first principle of decision making is never make a decision today which can be postponed until tomorrow. I'm going to qualify this as sort of. I think this was a very, very functional, almost an automatic, healthy principle before we got quite so far into technology. Essentially, we'll never have less information than we have today. Okay, so we always, if we can postpone a decision, then we can gather more information. But of course, you don't want to postpone it to the point where you're ineffective in your job. So good supervisors know that sometimes it's best to postpone because things shake out on their own, and you don't have to, sometimes you don't even have to make that decision. If you just wait another day, it solves itself. And that's really where the principle of decision making comes from. The principle of modesty is never appear better than your boss. Well, hopefully this is pretty straightforward. We never want to compete with the boss. The boss nearly always wins. A better strategy is to try to make the boss look good and do our jobs well at the same time. In many organizations, as supervisors advance, so do their favorite subordinates, or at least new opportunities open up for their favorite subordinates. So it's also good Darwinism to practice the principle of modesty. The last principle for peons is the principle of self-importance. The organization got along really well before we arrived, and they will get along just fine when we are gone. So we need the organization more than the organization needs us. Peons are pretty easy to fire, even legally, they're pretty easy to fire. So until you've established yourself as a very valuable, credible, trusted employee who does the job well, remember that they got along just fine without us. All right, that's enough about the principles for peons, and that's enough about the nature of organizations. We're going to move on to the nature of communication, and that comes in the other of the two chapters we have to read this unit. So we'll stop here. Thank you.